What's up, everybody? It's Jordan here from W&W with another How to Play Tyranids video, Mastering Shadow in the Warp. Yeah, this week we're talking about Shadow in the Warp, everyone's favorite army rule for our favorite bugs. I think this is a phenomenal army rule if you are able to use it wisely and kind of know the ins and outs of Shadow in the Warp. So, in this week's tactics video, I'm going to talk about exactly that and show you how I make the most of Shadow in the Warp. Zooming out a little bit and just talking about the basics of Shadow in the Warp before we really get into the statistics or the strategy of the ability itself. You trigger it once per game in either command phase, and every single enemy unit on the table must take a battle shock check. It's just on the table, so if anything's embarked in transport or if anything's in strategic reserves or deep strike, it's safe. Cannot be messed with Shadow in the Warp. In addition, with a recent change in June, I believe, if they are within 6 inches of a synapse model or a unit with the synapse keyword, they take that battle shock check at a -1. Okay, so if your Maleceptor or Zoanthropes, whatever, is extra close to your enemy, then that Shadow in the Warp check is going to be at -1. And then another kind of basic one is if you have a Neurotyrant on the field, then every single check is at an additional -1. So you can get a little saucy with some Synapse dudes right in somebody's face, get a -1. And then, of course, if you have that Neurotyrant on the field, then it's an additional -1. So every single battle shock will be at -2. One last thing to note before we move on to kind of the tactics of Shadow in the Warp is it must, you have to have a unit with the Shadow in the Warp rule on the table before, or if you are wanting to activate this, which pretty much almost always happens. Your Hive Tyrants, your Maleceptors, Neurotyrants, pretty much everything with Synapse has this key or has this ability. But it's something to, I guess, triple check before you do it and make a little blunder. As the incredible bug players we are, we need to ask ourselves, how should we pop shadows and how can we use it effectively in our game of Warhammer 40k? So these are a couple of rules of thumb for shadows and when you should trigger it. Okay, so almost always pop it in your opponent's command phase, almost all the time. This is because since it is in your opponent's command phase anytime, this is going to be before they score primary. So if you get lucky with your shadows, or if your opponent rather is unlucky with your shadows, there's a pretty good chance that you could knock them off of 1, 2, or all of their objective markers. That has happened to me multiple times. I have just absolutely decimated an opponent's primary score for an entire turn, and it really kind of leaves them struggling for the rest of the game, honestly, because a lot of times people will set up a really strong primary turn, you pop shadows, and then it's absolutely defeated. And then the next bullet point, this can also affect your opponent's secondaries. So slow roll your shadows. Have them draw their secondaries first before you even considering popping shadows. I think there's always a little bit of a rhythm of the game where you kind of know when you're going to pop shadows. However, take a step back, and have your opponent draw their secondaries, because it is differently timed in the command phase. You can technically call shadows, I believe, before your opponent draws secondaries. So don't let your opponent let you do that. Really wait to see what kind of secondaries they're playing. And we will talk about that in detail later on in the video, and really see if Shadows is an excellent, if Shadows has the potential to knock them off of primary score as well as secondary. So yeah, next, save it for a turn. You don't completely knock your opponent off primary. I play Tyranids in a way where it's kind of just denying their score as much as possible. I will just throw gargoyles or other units on objective markers to really box them out of their primary. And then if I have a turn where I'm not able to commit most of my army in order to do so, and it's kind of checking some of those other boxes as well, I will heavily consider a Shadow in the Warp to see if I can continue to deny a full 10 or a full 15 on their primary. So think about it that way. If you're not able to completely clear your opponent's models or units off an objective, maybe your shadows is going to swing your way, and maybe it's really going to help you. So that's another good reason to hold off and pop for shadows. And then last but not least, and the next slide is also talking about this as well, be careful of overextending with synapse units. I think the additional -1 to the battle shock for synapse units, if they're within 6, can often be a trap for Tyranid players. And again, we'll go into this in detail, but please be careful of overextending with your synapse units. You don't have to have your synapse units in front of every single unit before you pop shadows. I'll be honest, more often than not, I have 1 or 0 synapse units when I'm trying to pop shadows, just because I would rather pop it aggressively than wait for my opponent to fully take control of the board before I do so. So before you cowabunga all of your maliceptors, your neurolictors, or anything up to the front to really make sure that you're getting that additional -1 to the shadows and the warp check from your synapse, think about this slide. You can even screenshot it, take it on your phone, and, and then pull it up in your middle of the games. Don't run your synapse dudes out to die. And here's why. Synapse units are key units to the army. If you think about the roles that they kind of play, maliceptors are a very strong synapse unit. They're kind of an anchor point of the entire army. You have your neurolictors, which is passing out debuffs if your opponent fails battle shock. However, if your neurolictor is within 6 inches of your opponent's army right before they activate and charge and everything, your neurolictor is going to die. So I don't really advise throwing a neurolictor out there just to trigger that additional -1 because it is so important to your army. If you think about other synapse units, hive tyrants, you're definitely not going to want to have a hive tyrant out there. And then zoanthropes, you're going to want them to be in the back so that they can shoot and so that they can support your army from afar as opposed to up front. There's one synapse unit that I think might be kind of an idea to throw up there. Actually, two. You've got the Parasite of Mortrex. I think throwing him out there, if you're using him and just having him, pump up your shadows and then really deal some battle shock, that could be pretty cool. And you can also stack him with the Dirge Heart and Synaptic Nexus, and you can really be kind of deadly with that. So that's a good unit to do. And then in addition, the Broodlord with Gene Stealers, that's a unit that I don't like sending out turn 1, but oftentimes turn 2 or turn 3, they're probably in the mix and they're probably fighting people. So, you could consider thinking about your Broodlord, and if you're playing one, a Parasite, to throw out there to kind of trigger that additional -1. But yeah, and next, it isn't for sure to battle shock. So even if you set up these ridiculous wombo combos, like you have your Death Leaper, you have your Parasite with the Dirge Heart, and you have everything surrounding this Space Marine unit. It has a 6-up leadership, but with all of those minuses, then it's a 9 that they have to roll, and they roll a 10. So basically, you have put all of your eggs in one basket for this Space Marine unit to still just roll a 10, and then they can kill all the things that you put in front of them. So, I like to play Warhammer in a way where my decisions are as close to 100% as possible. And unfortunately, you really can't play that with Shadow in the Warp. So, it's tough, but oftentimes it is a gamble that I don't really want to take. Unless I have a Broodlord that is already in position, then cool. He's going to give -1. Or if a Maliceptor is really tanking it up the field, he'll give -1. But otherwise, I just want to keep these guys, hidden, safe, and supporting the rest of my army. And then my last bullet point is, what if you end up not wanting to shadows? And I often plan out my shadows turn ahead of time. However, there have been times where, my opponent's primary just doesn't work the way they want, or they score some secondaries that are really, just something that Shadows doesn't care about. What if your opponent scores assassination and no prisoners, and you have your Gene Stealer blob right in front of them, and they have so many units on objectives, and you're really not going to flip primary, even if your Broodlord gives the -1 to Shadows. So, it's just kind of the thought of don't overcommit units to something that could, not really beneficial for your overall game plan. don't just throw those bugs out there. You know what I mean? All right, this is my favorite slide in the entire video. I think these are just breaking down the statistics of being shadowed. I forget what the website was. It's like dice probability calculator or something. And I basically took the time to figure out what percentage or what were the chances for you rolling 2 dice to make these leadership saves below. Okay, so if we look at a Primarch or anything with a 5-up leadership save, that's like Black Templars when they do, I forget what it's called, but they have that one vow or devotion or whatever that makes them have a 5-up leadership. So that's an 83% chance that that unit is going to make their shadows or save their battle shock. That's not great. Then we look at just generic Space Marines, a 6-up. That's still a 72% for any of them to succeed their battle shock check. That's really, really high, in my opinion. Next up, even orcs, who I feel like are kind of known for, being scared or whatever, at least in earlier editions. They have a 7-up, which a 7-up is still a 58% chance, which is a better, a better coin flick or coin flip. So it's in their favor. We're even if we're trying to battle shock orcs, it's still really not, in the Tyranids' favor. But we look at a Necron Doomstalker. Don't ask me why I chose a Necron Doomstalker, but it's an 8-up, so that's when it starts heavily shifting into the Tyranids' favor with a 41% chance for them to save. That's not bad. I mean, that's getting to the point where I still wouldn't say that, oh, for sure these things are going to be battle shocked. However, it is something that maybe you can adjust your game plan to see about, and maybe be a little bit more optimistic in Shadow in the Warp for 8-up leaderships. And then the last column, something really scared at a 9+. You need to roll a 9+ into a Tyranid Shadow in the Warp. You only have a 27% chance to succeed that. So just look into perspective. Like if you are playing Tyranids and you do your Shadow in the Warp and your opponent is a Space Marine player and he only fails one of those things, odds are it's more statistical than you would think, and so I'm just kind of trying to point out that there are good and bad Shadow in the Warps. However, a lot of the times the odds are already stacked against your favor for a Tyranid player because you have to get to an 8-up on your battle shock check in order for it to be better than a coin flip for you. So think about that. But also this graph does a really good job of displaying the differences in statistics when you stack those buffs, which is kind of counterintuitive to the argument that I made before. But however, if you look at a Primarch going from an 83 to a 72, that's 11% drop of that. And of course, all these statistics are like 72.333333336. So everything's not perfectly round, but it's pretty close. And then from a 6-up to a 7, that's a pretty significant drop of 14%. So if you are able to stack these buffs, then it is definitely going to sway your Shadows in the Warp in a way. But a 14% drop, I don't believe is something to fully center your game plan around. But I think it's good to know the statistics and the numbers involving the Shadows in the Warp. These are the secondaries that you're looking for your opponent to draw in order to effectively capitalize on a good Shadow in the Warp. And we'll go over them very briefly, but honestly, there's 2 criteria for these. If they have to do an action, which means they can't be battle shocked, and if they have to take control of an objective marker, which means being battle shocked would be very difficult. So let's take a look at these secondaries that I've laid out and kind of see how Shadow in the Warp can affect them. First up, cleanse. You have to do both of those things. You have to control an objective, and then you have to do an action. So if you are able to shadow and maybe take off 2 or 3 units by being able to do that secondary by making the battle shock, that would be a very, very effective game plan and a huge detriment to your opponent. So cleanse is definitely one that you should think about. Storm hostile objective. It's going to be way harder for opponents to take your objective away from you if they don't have any objective control, which is great, Sabotage and recover assets. So the thing about sabotage and recover assets, I believe if your opponent commits to doing it and they are not able to do it at the end of your turn, because that's when it scores, then they have to try and do it again. So if you battle shock them and it's even harder for them to do those actions, then it can create a huge secondary point disparity between you and your opponent, and then really can put you ahead and your opponent grumbling about terrible secondaries. In addition, with things like sabotage and recover assets, honestly, one of the best things you can do, even though it probably doesn't look good at face value, is if your opponent doesn't score any points and they have to just discard stuff for command points. That's more command points for them to spend during your turn. However, the key thing about Tyranids and winning Warhammer 40k, scoring more points than your opponent. Command points don't always convert to victory points. And seeing secondaries being discarded is definitely, I think, a buff for you in that regard. Containment. You have to do an action and be somewhere. Easy peasy. Establish locus, do an action. Engage in all fronts. You have to be somewhere and not be battle shocked, the same as behind enemy lines. And then we go to extend battle lines and secure no man's land. These are okay, but they're definitely not like light bulb. I want to pop shadows right now. Because extend and secure, they're pretty easy to do. You just take the objective. You don't even have to take objectives that were previously controlled. You just take them, and you're just there. I really look out for cleanse, storm hostile, and then sabotage and recover assets. Those are kind of things that I think are really, really good because you have to be somewhere and you have to do an action, and some of them you have to do an action for an extended period of time. Think about it. This slide, warning, is just my opinion. And if I've tricked you to think that any of these other slides are not just my opinion, this one is strictly my opinion. So these are my thoughts about Shadow in the Warp and how I think about it when I'm playing Tyranids and why I'm excited to play Tyranids with Shadow in the Warp. First up, make sure you submit your army list to the list review show. We're doing it every single Monday, late afternoon Eastern Standard Time. Go ahead and check out the community page in our channel. Subscribe, of course, and then submit your army list. I'm going through about, I think, 7 lists every single week. We did a live show this Monday. It was phenomenal. I had a great time. I think chat had a good time too, and we got through some really cool lists. In addition, if you'd like to support the channel and also support your ideas being reviewed by me, myself, consider becoming a member and being a part of the channel. If you're a member, then your list gets rocketed to the front of the line. I apologize. That's just how it works. When we have so many lists that are submitted. Currently, in the queue that we have going right now, we don't have any members that have submitted lists. So go ahead. If you really want your list to be reviewed, consider being a member and then pop it in that community tab. Okay, that's enough shilling for the stream and the channel. Let's get back to my opinions and thoughts about Shadow in the Warp itself. If we look at it, I think Games Workshop actually did a phenomenal job of putting a very flavorful army rule onto the Tyranids. I think it definitely kind of pictures the inevitable doom and the unknown of the Tyranid army. And that's kind of what I think Tyranids are all about. It's just this inevitable swallowing up of the universe and swallowing up of your units being able to do actions and score points because they are battle shocked. So I definitely think that Games Workshop has done a great job of just really hitting the nail on the head on a really cool army rule. It has the potential to be absolutely devastating for your opponent. I have played games where like 9 out of 10 of my opponent's units have just been immediately battle shocked, and then their entire game plan is thrown out the window, and then I can really just capitalize that and then put the final nail in the coffin and then win and make happy skittering noises for the rest of the day. But in the same regard, and on the other side of the coin, it also has the potential to do nothing. Your opponent can't insane bravery or anything out of it, so they have to take battle shock checks. But however, they can't just simply make all their battle shock checks, and that is sad. But it's a dice rolling game, and in a dice rolling game, oftentimes somebody has to roll better dice than the other person, and in that case, it would be your opponent. And that definitely happens. And if you remember the statistics we looked at earlier on in this video, it actually has a much higher chance of it happening than we would believe or what we would like to think. So as you're popping shadows, understand that there's a good chance that it doesn't go your way. And then last, but certainly not least, I want to just talk about whether or not Shadow in the Warp can be balanced and should it be balanced. In my opinion, if it were to be balanced, people have thrown out ideas of like, oh, if you pop shadows in the warp, everything takes battle shock, but then you get to pick 1 or 2 units to be battle shocked. Uh, that would be incredibly broken. I think anytime that Games Workshop takes the rolling dice effect out of the game, I think it is only in the realm of I don't want to say toxicity, but it is only in the realm of frustration for the people playing the game. Think about Eldar and Sisters of Battle. I really like playing Eldar. I'm allergic to Sisters of Battle, but that's okay. But I do think there is a fair argument that the Fate dice and the Strands of Fate or whatever for Eldar is kind of like a feels bad thing. And being able to just say, oh, don't even roll dice, this really bad thing happens to your army, I think that would be really bad. And I even me as a Tyranid player, that is not something I necessarily want to see put into the game. I would rather Shadow in the Warp be this inevitable doom that even the Tyranids are not fully aware of how much impact that it can have to your opponent's small, little, scared brains. That's the video. That's it for today. Thank you so much for hanging out all the way to the end. We really appreciate your support. Like, comment, subscribe, join the Army List review show, and have a great week.